I knew the HOA had it out for me, but I never thought they'd go this far. When I pulled into my driveway and saw nothing but a pile of smoldering ash where my backyard shed used to be, my blood boiled. That shed wasn't just some rickety old structure. I had built it with my own hands, spending weekends perfecting every detail. It stored my tools, my late father's workbench, and memories that money couldn't replace. And now? Gone. Burned to the ground. Finally, that eyesore is gone. Came the familiar, nasal voice of Greta Dawson, the HOA president, standing smugly on the sidewalk with her arms crossed. Her iron-gray bob didn't move an inch in the breeze, as stiff as the woman herself. I clenched my fists. "You did this." She scoffed. The HOA issued multiple warnings about that abomination. It didn't match the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. We took necessary action. Necessary action? My voice was dangerously low. "You mean arson?" Greta rolled her eyes as if I was being dramatic. "The board approved it. We had professionals dismantle it and dispose of it properly." I pointed at the still smoking debris. "That doesn't look like dismantling to me. That looks like fire." "It was an unfortunate accident during removal," she said, not even pretending to sound apologetic. I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to do something I'd regret. "You're going to pay for this, Greta." She chuckled. "Oh, Yarden, you're always so dramatic. You should be thanking us. Property values will go up now that your mess is gone." I turned on my heel and stormed inside, already dialing my lawyer. Greta had no idea what she had just started, and she definitely didn't know what I had just finalized the day before. Because as of yesterday, I was the new owner of the entire HOA's land lease. In simpler terms, Greta and her little board of tyrants didn't own the land under their own houses anymore. I did. The rage simmered beneath my skin as I paced my living room. I wasn't just angry, I was calculating. Greta and her lackeys thought they could burn down my property and walk away unscathed. They had no idea the ground they stood on was already shifting beneath them. I pulled out a thick folder from my desk drawer, flipping through the pages that detailed my recent acquisition. Every inch of the HOA's common land, including the roads, sidewalks, and even the green spaces, was under my name now. They hadn't paid attention when I quietly bought the land lease through a shell company, and now they were about to learn the cost of their arrogance. I made a few calls, starting with my lawyer. We discussed the legal ramifications of what had just happened to my shed. Arson, destruction of property, unlawful seizure. Greta and her board had crossed too many lines. I wanted charges filed, but I had something bigger in mind first. By the time I stepped outside again, a few neighbors had gathered near the wreckage of my shed. Some looked uneasy, others indifferent. One of them, Mr. Caldwell, an older man who had lived here for decades, shook his head. "They really did it, huh?" he muttered, eyeing the blackened debris. I nodded, scanning the faces around me. "Yeah, and they think they're getting away with it." A few people exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up against the HOA outright. Fear. Greta had ruled with an iron fist for too long. People were too afraid of fines, retaliation, or worse. I wasn't. I spotted Greta a few houses down, chatting with two board members, probably gloating about what they had done. I strode toward them, my steps deliberate. She noticed me approaching but didn't move away. "Ah, Yarden." Finally calmed down. I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of her. The board members beside her, a wiry man named Alan and a woman named Judith, shifted uneasily. "You're going to regret this," I said, my voice steady. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Regret what?" "Enforcing the HOA standards." I held up the folder. "You just destroyed property on land that now belongs to me." Alan frowned. "What are you talking about?" I flipped open to the official deed transfer and held it up for them to see. As of yesterday, I own the land lease for every public space in this neighborhood: the roads, the sidewalks, the park, even the strip of land in front of your houses. Greta's expression barely faltered, but I saw the flicker of concern in her eyes. "That's ridiculous." Judith leaned in, scanning the documents. Her face paled. "Greta, these are real." Greta snatched the papers from my hand, flipping through them quickly. Her grip tightened on the edges. "This doesn't change anything. The HOA still governs this neighborhood." I crossed my arms. "The HOA manages rules, but they don't own the land anymore." "I do. And that means I get to decide who gets access to it." Alan swallowed hard. You can't just cut off access to the roads." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I can. And if I choose to revoke the HOA's privileges, you'll have to negotiate with me for access to everything from street parking to walking on the sidewalks. Greta's face darkened. You wouldn't dare. I took a step closer. You burned down my shed. You destroyed my property and laughed about it. What do you think I'm willing to do? For the first time, I saw a crack in her carefully maintained composure. She had always lorded her authority over the neighborhood, secure in the belief that no one could challenge her. Now, she was realizing just how wrong she had been. I'll be contacting every homeowner about their new lease agreements, I continued. You'll find that the HOA no longer has the power it once did. Greta's lips pressed into a thin line. You're playing a dangerous game, Yarden. I shrugged. No more dangerous than the one you've been playing for years. With that, I turned and walked away, already planning my next move. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Greta Dawson wasn't the one in control. I was. The neighborhood had been under Greta's thumb for years, but today, the tables had turned. She had expected me to be just another homeowner she could push around. Instead, she found herself standing on land that was no longer hers to control, and she knew it. I turned away from her and walked back toward my house, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The quiet murmurs from the gathered neighbors told me that word was already spreading. People who had been afraid to challenge the HOA were beginning to realize that things were about to change. The power dynamic had shifted, and this was just the beginning. Inside, I made another call to my lawyer. The destruction of my shed was criminal, and I wasn't letting Greta walk away from it without consequences. I gathered the security footage from my cameras, which had captured the so-called removal process in full detail. The so-called professionals Greta had hired hadn't been careful or methodical. They had set fire to the structure and walked away with smug satisfaction. The footage, alongside my deed to the land, would be more than enough to take this to court. But I wasn't planning on stopping there. Over the next few days, I worked quietly behind the scenes. I met with homeowners who had suffered under Greta's rule, people who had been fined for trivial things, forced to repaint their homes over minor infractions, or threatened for speaking out. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Greta's reign had been built on intimidation. Now, she was the one scrambling. Alan and Judith, the board members who had stood beside her, were having second thoughts. I knew because I caught Alan outside his house one morning, pacing near his mailbox with a worried expression. He hesitated when he saw me, but didn't turn away. Yarden, he said, his voice quieter than usual. We need to talk. I stopped a few feet from him, watching as he glanced around nervously. Greta's losing it, he admitted. She's angry, but more than that, she's scared. She doesn't know how to handle this. That's not my problem, I said. She brought this on herself. Alan exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Look, I didn't know she was going to burn your shed down. She told us she had a crew to handle it, but never said anything about fire. If I had known. You still let it happen, I interrupted. You sat on that board and let her do whatever she wanted. Alan's shoulders sagged. I was just trying to keep my house from getting targeted too. I studied him for a moment. Fear had kept him in line, just like it had kept so many others silent. But now that Greta was vulnerable, he was looking for a way out. Then do something about it, I said. His brow furrowed. Like what? Resign. Publicly. And tell the neighborhood exactly why. He hesitated, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was afraid of Greta, but now he was even more afraid of what would happen if he stayed on her sinking ship. If I do this, he said slowly, you're going to take her down, aren't you? I didn't blink. She burned my property to the ground and laughed about it. What do you think? Alan swallowed hard, then nodded. All right, I'll do it. True to his word, Alan called for an emergency HOA meeting that evening. It was supposed to be a closed board meeting, but homeowners caught wind of it and showed up in force. Greta was already inside when I arrived, sitting at the head of the table with her arms crossed, her expression a mask of barely restrained fury. She didn't acknowledge me when I walked in. Instead, her gaze was locked on Alan, who stood at the front of the room, gripping a piece of paper like a lifeline. I'm stepping down from the HOA board, Alan announced. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Greta stiffened. What? She snapped. Alan cleared his throat. I can't be a part of this anymore. The HOA was supposed to protect property values, not destroy people's homes. Burning down a shed because it didn't match the aesthetic was too far. I won't stand by and pretend it was justified. Greta stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. You coward, she hissed. Do you think siding with him will save you? Alan ignored her. I'm resigning, effective immediately. Judith, the other board member, looked around the room, seeing the shifting expressions of the homeowners. The fear that had once kept them silent was eroding. She stood up as well. I'm resigning too, she said. Greta's face darkened. You're all pathetic, she spat. I think you're the one who's finished here, I said, stepping forward. This neighborhood doesn't belong to you anymore, Greta. And now, neither does the HOA. She turned to me, her jaw clenched. You think you can just take over? I don't have to, I said. The homeowners will decide what happens next. And I have a feeling they won't want you in charge anymore. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now openly discussing new leadership, new rules in HOA that actually worked for the residents instead of ruling over them. Greta's grip tightened on the edge of the table. You'll regret this, she said. I met her glare without flinching. No, Greta. The only one with regrets here is you. With Alan and Judith gone, the HOA was effectively dead. And as for Greta, she had finally lost the one thing she valued most, her control. The meeting didn't end with a vote or a formal decision, just a low hum of voices, the weight of something irreversible settling over the room. Greta knew she had lost. The moment Alan and Judith walked out, the HOA was nothing more than a gutted shell. She lingered for a moment, gripping the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her gaze flickered toward the scattering homeowners, searching for some last vestige of support. But the spell she had cast over them for years had broken. No one rushed to her defense. No one met her eyes. The silence stretched between us. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stalked out. I followed her with my gaze, watching as the door swung shut behind her. The air in the room felt lighter. Judith exhaled, rubbing her temples. I can't believe I stayed on the board as long as I did, she muttered. I thought keeping my head down would make things easier, but that was just giving her more power. Alan nodded absently, still gripping the resignation letter he had read aloud. We let it happen. Homeowners started filtering out, some talking in hushed tones, others shaking their heads. A few stopped to glance at me, as if weighing their thoughts before approaching. One of them, a man named Roger who had lived in the community longer than I had, stepped forward. So what happens now? I stuffed my hands in my pockets. That depends. Do you all want to keep the HOA or scrap it? The murmurs grew louder. Opinions clashed. Some wanted to dissolve it entirely, while others argued that a properly run HOA could actually be useful. The debate was inevitable, but for now, I wasn't interested in playing mediator. I left them to it and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the streets quieter than usual. Greta's car was still parked in her driveway, but the inside of her house remained dark. I wasn't naive enough to think she was done scheming. Back at my house, I locked the door behind me and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The adrenaline from the meeting was still running through me, making it impossible to sit still. I had won a major battle, but something told me Greta wouldn't go down without taking a few cheap shots first. The next morning, my instincts proved right. I woke to find a notice taped to my front door. Not an official HOA document, Greta no longer had the authority for that, but a letter printed on thick, expensive paper. She was threatening legal action. The letter claimed that my acquisition of the land lease was unlawful, that I had manipulated the sale, and that she would be pursuing a reversal through the courts. It was a last-ditch effort to claw back power, but it was flimsy at best. I tossed the letter onto my kitchen table and dialed my lawyer. He picked up after the second ring. I was expecting your call. Greta's trying to fight the land lease transfer, I said. Of course she is, he replied dryly. But she doesn't have a leg to stand on. Everything was done legally, with full transparency. If she actually files a lawsuit, it'll go nowhere. But she might try to tie you up in paperwork just to be a nuisance. Let her try, I said. I'm not backing down. He chuckled. I figured. I'll keep an eye on any filings. In the meantime, you might want to check in with the county records office, make sure she's not pulling anything sneaky behind the scenes. That was a good idea. Greta wasn't above bending rules to get her way. By midday, I was sitting in the county records office, flipping through files with an employee who had seen more HOA disputes than he cared to admit. Your name's all over this land lease, he said, scanning the documents. Clean sale. No loopholes for her to exploit. But... He frowned, flipping a few pages back. But what? She submitted a request last week to reclassify part of the neighborhood's common areas as historic grounds which, if approved, could make it harder for you to enforce changes. I exhaled sharply. She was trying to lock things in before I took control. Looks like it. But the request hasn't been processed yet. If you want to contest it, now's the time. I didn't hesitate. Let's shut it down. An hour later, I had filed the necessary paperwork to block Greta's attempt at preserving her old power structure. It was another nail in the coffin of her influence. When I got home, I noticed something strange. Greta's car was gone, but her front door was slightly ajar. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Roger, the neighbor who had asked about the future of the HOA, was standing on the sidewalk, frowning toward her house. She left in a hurry, he said. Didn't even close the door all the way. I approached cautiously, pushing the door open a little more. The inside of the house was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, drawers left open, suitcases half-packed. Greta had fled. She must have realized she had no way to win and decided to cut her losses before things got worse. By the evening, word had spread that she was gone. No one knew exactly where she went, but the neighborhood was buzzing with the news. There was no victory parade, no dramatic celebration, just a quiet, collective exhale. The grip Greta had on the community was officially broken. I stood outside, watching as people exchanged relieved glances, some already discussing what they wanted to do with the HOA moving forward. Roger clapped me on the shoulder. You really did it. Wasn't just me, I said. People finally stood up. Yeah, but we needed someone to start it, he said. And you did. I didn't argue. The neighborhood still had work to do, but for the first time in years, people had a say in their own community. And Greta? Wherever she had gone, she was no longer our problem. I turned back toward my house, glancing at the empty space where my shed used to be. Time to rebuild this time, without anyone trying to burn it down. Greta's departure left an eerie silence in the neighborhood. People were relieved, sure, but it was the kind of relief that came with uncertainty. Without her iron grip, the HOA was in freefall. Some homeowners saw an opportunity for real change, while others worried about what came next. No one could ignore the power shift, though. I owned the land they walked on, and they all knew it now. The morning after Greta's hasty exit, I found myself sitting on my back porch, staring at the empty patch of ground where my shed had stood. The anger hadn't faded, but it had settled into something sharper, more focused. Greta was gone, but her damage remained. And I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I spent the better part of the day making phone calls. My lawyer confirmed that Greta hadn't officially filed any lawsuits before skipping town, meaning her threats held no weight. The county clerk's office informed me that her last attempt at manipulating the land classification had been formally denied. Every move she had made to hold on to power had crumbled beneath her. By early afternoon, I was standing in front of what remained of my shed, assessing the damage. The fire had destroyed almost everything, leaving behind little more than a few scorched metal tools and charred fragments of wood. It wasn't just about the property loss, it was what it represented. Greta had thought she could erase something I had built with my own hands, but I was going to make sure my next move was something she'd never be able to undo. As I was surveying the wreckage, Roger appeared at the edge of my yard, hands in his pockets. He had been one of the first to acknowledge what had happened, and now he looked even more uneasy. Some of the neighbors are talking, he said. They want to know what happens to the HOA now. I didn't take my eyes off the wreckage. That's up to them. They're looking to you for an answer, he pressed. You're the only one who stood up to Greta and won. I finally turned to face him. I didn't do this to run an HOA. I did it to stop them from walking all over people. Roger nodded. I get that, but there's a meeting happening tonight. People are going to start making decisions, and if you're not there to guide things, someone else will step in. That was the last thing I wanted, another power-hungry opportunist taking Greta's place. Sighing, I wiped my hands on my jeans. Fine, let's see what they have to say. By the time evening rolled around, the community center was packed. Without an official HOA board, the meeting was run by whoever stood up first. A few concerned homeowners voiced their opinions. Some wanted the HOA dissolved entirely. Others hoped for a restructured version with fair rules and proper oversight. What no one wanted was another Greta. I didn't speak right away, letting the discussion play out. It was clear that people were still adjusting to the idea that they had a real say in how things work now. Eventually, the room quieted as more eyes turned toward me. You all already know where I stand, I said. I didn't buy the land to control anyone. I bought it because I was tired of people like Greta thinking they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. A woman near the back crossed her arms. But what happens now? Are you just going to keep charging us for access? I shook my head. No, I'm not interested in making money off of this. The land lease will remain in place, but I'm not going to use it as leverage to control anyone. If people want to rebuild the HOA into something functional, that's their choice. But I won't let it become what it was under Greta. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Some people still looked skeptical, but most seemed relieved. Then, a voice I hadn't expected spoke up. Judith, the former board member, stood near the side of the room, arms folded tightly. If you're serious about that, then there needs to be a way to stop this from ever happening again. I met her gaze. Go on. We need a binding agreement, she said. Something that limits what any future HOA can do. No more arbitrary fines. No power-hungry presidents. Just something to keep basic order without turning into a dictatorship. It wasn't a bad idea. If the neighborhood wanted to keep some version of an HOA, it needed to be reined in. I can draft something, I said. But I'm not the one who should decide what goes in it. That's up to all of you. The discussion shifted after that. People started throwing out suggestions, reasonable guidelines, protections against abuse, transparency rules. By the time the meeting ended, there was a clear path forward, a new charter, strict limits on power, and a firm agreement that no one would ever be able to pull what Greta had again. As the crowd dispersed, Roger caught up with me outside. Never thought I'd see the day people actually agreed on something around here. I chuckled. Give it time. Someone will find something to argue about. Maybe, he said. But at least it won't be because of some tyrant running things. I watched as homeowners headed home, talking with a sense of ease that hadn't existed before. The neighborhood still had work to do, but for the first time in years, it felt like real change was possible. Later that night, I stood in my backyard, looking at the empty space where my shed had once been. I wasn't done yet. Greta had left plenty of damage in her wake, but I would rebuild. This time, on my terms. The next morning, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet. Greta's departure had left a power vacuum, and although the meeting had put things in motion, there was still a lingering tension in the air. People were wary, uncertain about how things would unfold. I spent the early hours sorting through paperwork, finalizing the last legal hurdles to ensure the HOA's authority remained permanently limited. My lawyer had already filed the necessary documents to protect the land lease from any future manipulation, ensuring that no one, not Greta, not any future board, could ever use it as a weapon again. By mid-morning, I heard the sound of a truck pulling up outside. Stepping out onto my porch, I spotted a crew unloading fresh lumber and supplies onto my driveway. The time had come to rebuild my shed. Roger strolled over from across the street, hands tucked into his jacket pockets as he eyed the materials. Didn't waste any time, did you? He glanced at the stacked wood. Going for something bigger this time? Stronger, I corrected. And fireproof. He let out a low whistle. Can't blame you for wanting some extra protection after what happened. I nodded, watching as the workers started measuring the foundation. This isn't just about replacing what I lost. It's about making sure no one ever thinks they can pull something like this again. Roger studied me for a long moment before giving a slow nod. You know, people are talking. They're finally realizing how much they let Greta get away with. Some of them are even embarrassed. They should be, I said, crossing my arms. She ruled with fear, and they let her. He exhaled, kicking at a loose pebble on the pavement. Yeah, but fear's a hell of a thing. It makes people stay quiet when they should be fighting back. I understood that all too well. But now, the fear was gone, and in its place was something closer to determination. As the construction crew worked, a few neighbors stopped by to watch. Some offered polite nods, others just observed from a distance. The neighborhood was still adjusting to the shift in power, and I could tell people weren't sure where they stood with me yet. Then, sometime in the afternoon, Alan approached. He looked different, less anxious, more resolved. Got a minute? He asked. I gestured to the side of the yard, away from the noise of the workers. I wanted to apologize, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, for going along with Greta's nonsense for as long as I did. I should have spoken up sooner. You should have, I agreed. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Not gonna sugarcoat it, huh? Not my style. He sighed, hands on his hips. Look, I know I screwed up, but I want to make things right. A few of us have been talking about forming a homeowners committee, not an HOA, just a group to handle maintenance, keep things running smoothly. No fines, no abuse of power. Just people looking out for each other. I studied him, weighing his words. And you're planning to be part of it? If the neighborhood lets me, he said. I want to prove I'm not the guy who just stood by anymore. I considered that. Alan had been complicit, But he had also been one of the first to distance himself from Greta when things fell apart. If he was serious about rebuilding trust, I wasn't going to stop him. Fine, I said. But if I see any sign of someone trying to seize control again, I'll shut it down. Fair enough, he said with a nod. People are done with tyrants around here. With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving me to watch the crew continue their work. By sunset, the frame of the new shed was already taking shape. The smell of fresh wood filled the air, replacing the lingering scent of burned debris. As I stood there, taking it all in, Judith walked up, her expression unreadable. "Looks sturdy," she said, nodding toward the construction. "It'll be better than the last one," I said. She hesitated, then let out a breath. "I wanted to thank you for not turning into another Greta. A lot of people were afraid that once you had control, you'd use it the same way she did." "That was never the plan," I said. "I know that now," she admitted. "And I think the others do too." I glanced around, noticing how the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt different. People weren't walking on eggshells anymore. Conversations were happening openly, without fear of some ridiculous fine or arbitrary rule. "They'll get used to it," I said. Judith nodded. "Yeah, I think they will." As she walked away, I took one last look at my new shed before heading inside. Greta was gone. The HOA was powerless, and the neighborhood was finally free. For the first time in a long time, things were exactly as they should be.